everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the In Full Bloom Book Club. Here we utilize the transformative power of storytelling to explore perspectives and to cultivate empathy, compassion, and connection. Our topic in question for this season is collective grief and trauma. Our season questions and topics for exploration are: how does trauma shape us? What consequences of collective trauma are we facing today? And how can we support one another in navigating collective grief? Currently, we are reading Riding the Lightning, A Year in the Life of a New York City Paramedic by Anthony Almojera. Physical and digital book purchase options are in the description box below, so go ahead and get you one. This episode will be discussing sections 1 through 4. There will be lots of spoilers, so go read the chapters and come back to join the discussion. If you enjoy this kind of content and value what we are doing here, you can show your support by liking, commenting, and subscribing below. So, we start all of our episodes off with a quote of the day, and today is Asia's Day. So, Asia, can you share your quote of the day, por favor?
Sí, I shall. You all are familiar with this quote, either from just knowing me or seeing like the signature in our email. But the quote is, "The best way to find yourself is to lose yourself in the service of others." It's by Mahatma Gandhi. So I discovered this quote a few years back. I was in a rough place. It was around the time when we first like built In Full Bloom,
Mhm.
and it kind of, there's two parts to it. It just really inspired me, one, to learn more about myself and the work that we're doing here, but it also was kind of like a life lesson that I also learned as the way that I give to others, how I ultimately lost myself. So I saw it in a reversed way as well. When I gave a lot of myself to someone, I lost myself as well. So it has like a double meaning to me. So yeah, that's why I chose it today.
Lovely. Thank you for sharing, Asia. So, I'm going to go ahead and read our reading summary. So, this is just a basic synopsis of the first 4 chapters of the novel. So, in the first third of this book, we learn a lot about Anthony's difficult upbringing, formative experiences as an EMS worker, and the events leading up to the outbreak of the coronavirus. The prologue opens with a scene straight out of 2020 nightmares. Almojera and his team are working diligently to revive an unconscious woman struck by what can only be assumed to be the coronavirus. Almojera and his team lose her, and he reflects over the choice her husband had to make when leaving his wife, a choice of whether to attend to his wife's needs or help out the slammed nursing home he's working at, a raw depiction of the kind of choices that many of us have faced in the past few years. Almojera goes on to summarize the impact of the virus on EMS workers, noting how ill-equipped they were for something of that magnitude. He floats between present day and the past often throughout this section. Almojera begins his recounts in October 2019, when a close friend and colleague, Joe, has heart issues, dying before the end of the year. He reminisces on his beginnings and the mentors that helped him become the professional he is today, including Joe. Through EMS work, he has created a chosen family, many of whom are part of a group that he lovingly refers to as the group home. Many of these individuals are colleagues who he works tirelessly with. But passion and hard work isn't enough. We learn of the pitfalls of the station and EMS services in New York altogether. While bringing in the new year in Australia and talking to 2 Australian paramedics, it becomes clear how busy, chaotic, and tragic his work is, as these EMS workers had vastly different experiences, having not responded to a shooting well over a year. The first few chapters are also dusted with insight on his chaotic upbringing, including how addiction, crime, and poor health have taken the lives of so many he knew and loved, including his older brother Richie. Anthony paints a picture of the state of mind that he was in going into 2020, having recently ended a relationship, having lost his dear friend Joe, and desiring a break from the insanity of Brooklyn EMT in exchange for a simple life running a pizzeria in Australia. Nevertheless, he returns home to New York right before all hell breaks loose. So, per usual, our first question is general overall impressions, thoughts, and remarks about the first 4 chapters of the book.
There's definitely a lot of, like, setting the scene, and it was, like, at certain points in reading it, for me, just felt like a lot of different characters to, like, remember different things about them, and in the midst of, like, the exposition of it all, just, um, being, like, inundated with some of, like, the more intense details of his life, it was just like a whirlwind for this first part of the book.
Yeah, I agree also, Elena. It's a lot of people, a lot of names. There are times where I was trying to like write stuff down and keep track of who's who. I was trying to follow along with the baseline to figure out like just to stay in tune with the story. But I noticed like it's just the way it's being told, it's hard to do that. But I will speak to I'll speak to this later, but I think that was intentional. I really like where this is going. I like the moments, especially towards the end of this section. He's looking at things from hindsight, basically. When he talks to the two paramedics and they're kind of talking about they haven't seen anything crazy or whatever, and now he makes the connections to that moment to where eventually this story will lead. I like those moments.
My general impressions of the novel. So I'm really excited about it thus far. I think his I think making sense of his upbringing and the trauma that he experienced, the tragedy that he experienced, making sense of what he does now with that in mind is really interesting. Um I think I love that we're gathering so much information about who he is, about the other people that he's around, about the places he's gone, not only like the places he's visited, but also just about the corner store that he goes to or the sandwich shop that he goes to. There's such like vivid descriptions of these places and these people that I think it tells us a lot about him and his experience and his perspective. So I'm really excited about that journey that we go on with him. And yeah, like I was a psychology major in undergrad, and I've always been really interested in the human mind. So kind of being able to take a deep dive into like what makes Anthony Anthony. And we see this person who like essentially has a cape on. I mean, like the type of people who do EMS work to me are just like superheroes. You know what I mean? It's just like how can you have the courage, the focus, the um that just requires so many very unique skills. It takes a special type of person to do that type of work. Hearing like what made that type of person is really interesting to me. Um whilst also I love that there's a humility to how he speaks about himself in terms of not just saying like I love the work and I'm passionate about the people, but there's also an element of I'm a thrill seeker. There's a self awareness of all the things that make him successful in his role, whether that be deemed as kind of positive traits or not. So I think that's really interesting. So yeah, I'm really enjoying it so far. I think for me as well, there's a lot of kind of having to sift through to make sense of like, okay, where are we in the story and making sure I'm sticking with the line of things. But also I think that's my like uh process oriented brain wanting to make sense of the narrative and maybe like an opportunity to kind of practice letting go of that is useful to kind of just take the information as it is. And I wonder like what that will do for our understanding of the narrative as a whole.
In the first four sections of this novel, Almojera describes each individual and place introduced in detail. How do these details affect your experience with the story? What purpose do they serve in the narrative?
Well, I will say I can't recall exactly what moment it was, but I found myself getting teary-eyed. And first of all, we're at the beginning of the story. It's too early to be doing that type of foolishness. Um, I would imagine that I wouldn't be so connected to the characters, but I think because there is so much information about the places, their connection. I mean, the people, their connection to him, about their personal histories. I think you do become very connected to the people. But yeah, I'm curious to know what you all think about because that's what I was kind of alluding to before. Like maybe there's something special, like a you. I don't whether it be intentional or not. There's something unique that this story brings into how we think about the full narrative because it kind of does so much shifting between the present day and past and giving so much background information.
It reminds me of a little bit of one of the books we read in our first season, Heaven, in the way it feels like sometimes a stream of consciousness that's happening when he's like telling the story. There's just like memories and things kind of coming up in the background of his mind while things are happening right in front of him, or at least in this retelling of what's happening to him. I feel one that's intentional, and I feel it's intentional in the way because he's placing us in his story as him, and how although all of these things are happening, it just kind of like feels like a flooding of stories, a flooding of things that's happening because you're rushing. There's emergencies happening, and there's that energy to it, and I sense that with the way he's telling stories. He will start a story and then go back to like what's happening, and then like another story kind of interweave because he like remembers something. It almost, so I would describe it like I was getting a little bit anxious reading because it was just so many different moments happening. It felt like the pacing was like picking up at certain moments, and um it just felt like I was him and experiencing that adrenaline when these kind of terrifying things are happening. Watching, having to resuscitate someone, or going to the scene of a crime, and or witnessing people are just scared. Kind of felt like him inserting a lot of these different stories is probably to help place us in that same headspace.
Yeah, I definitely agree. The way that the details come about in terms of like it's almost like he's going on a tangent. Um, so the way that it impacted my experience of the story is like it felt like the speaker is talking directly to me and they're just telling a story casually. But as far as the purpose that they serve in the narrative, I think it helps the reader develop like a deeper understanding for the characters, like rather than just having the name and, oh, this is my coworker, you kind of are able to learn a little bit more about them and like, oh, that makes sense that this is how they would die because their personality was always brush off symptoms or whatever. Like you kind of understand why certain stuff happens. And yeah, I feel like I appreciate that there's so many details included, even though it can be hard to follow sometimes. I think it still helps to tie the story together.
I'll say it also, obviously there's like a certain casualness to it because it's so like stream of consciousness, almost like familial. But I also wrote down storytelling or like the art of storytelling over like plot. So when you think of like a plot chart, you're thinking of like I don't know, it's called the rising action or whatever, and then you get to the climax, and then like you're looking for sometimes I think, again, just like a very process oriented person, I'm looking for beginning, middle, end. And that linear way of thinking is just kind of how I experience a lot of things in the world. And yeah, there's a flow to this. And I think it really emphasizes just like the journey of the storytelling and of understanding the experience, immersing yourself in, like you were saying, Asia, immersing yourself in his experience, immersing yourself and even the overwhelm of it all.
I like that, Tia. I agree. Especially because one, this is something that's real. This happened to all. We've experienced some effects of the pandemic in some way, and so it's not just this linear thing for any of us. Some of us are still experiencing the effects of what's happened. So I think it's one a really clever choice to incorporate, like you said, these stories on top of you know the traditional sense of like plot, basically.
Yeah, and that's kind of the unique element as well. So it's a universal event, and the uniqueness, the draw is his personal story, but also there's a universalness in the fact that he's talking about his like personal story, because like the richness and the intricacies of that is true to like what all of our experiences are. All of us, we were impacted very differently.
Yeah, and he interweaves like a lot of different stories because we all were connected during that time. We all like, were experiencing that one thing all at the same time in different ways. So yeah, I agree.
So, viewers, we just wanted to remind you to like, comment, and subscribe. Your support means so very much to us. We'd love to hear from you, and yeah, it's a great way to support our channel. So, we're gonna move on to question number two. Question number two is on page 71. After having discussed the details of his brother Richie's death and funeral, Almojera ends a paragraph with a single line sentence: I didn't want to stand with them, referring to his family. This one line seemed to be heavy with tension. Please speak to your interpretation of the underlying meaning behind this quote.
When I first read it, I kind of like I didn't have that moment where I was like I stopped and was like processing. I just kind of kept it moving because I was like, yeah, okay, yeah, me too. I would have done the same, because like I couldn't blame him. I can see how. So the way he describes himself, and he he's very contrasted against his family. His family's very chaotic, and very dysfunctional. And like in the story, he mentions his mother and his father said that they never had to worry about him. He just was that kid who wasn't getting into trouble like everyone else. And so I can see how, on one hand, it was just like, I am disconnected from y'all. Although this is a really tragic time, his brother just died and they're burying him. And you want to come together, but like there was never that sense of togetherness to begin with. So why should we pretend in this moment, this very intimate moment, or at least that's kind of how I would internalize and think about it. In your darkest moments, it's hard to pretend, or like they say like fake the funk, but I don't see Anthony being that person to really do that necessarily. So I can see why he was opposed. He's standing opposed of his family. It was just there's been clearly a disconnect and how they just kind of operate.
Yeah, so like in rereading that line, I didn't want to stand with them. Like obviously there's that like creating a physical distance, but I think like underlying the situation or the circumstances of that specific line, it's almost like he's dissatisfied with the fact that he shares anything with them. Like I remember Tia earlier when you had said that there seems to be some underlying thrill seeking with the main character. I'm like, I kind of made a connection that it seems like the whole family has like thrill seeking. Like the mom, they were saying she had money for groceries, but just the why pay full price when I can get it discounted thrill, or the brother, you know, knowing that he's in like a street lifestyle, but let me try to get over on someone. It seems like in this moment he's seeing like, this is my brother, like this is my family. It seemed like in this moment he felt like when he says I didn't want to stand with them, it sounds like he's essentially just saying like I don't want to be a part of this, basically.
So, a few things. I'm going to try to make this as coherent as possible. Um, so I was trying to make sense of like what he may have been experiencing then. So, like, was it that it was just the overwhelming amount of like sadness and mourning and things like that? If that was too difficult for him, because I think right before that he talks about the fact that I don't know, maybe they were doing like the repast or not the repast. What do you call it when people come over to people's house and the days like before the funeral? And are like bringing like food and things like that and just like in mourning and comforting. I don't remember what that's
Is it
called.
a wake? Or I don't know. It's been a minute
Hmm,
since.
maybe. Okay. Well, yeah, they were doing that type of thing, and I think he was just saying he didn't want to be there. So that came right before then. So I was like, maybe he's just expressing there. It's as simple as that. Like it was just too much for him. He didn't want to stand with them and be mourning and be kind of the center piece of that whole situation. Um, Another thing that came up was that maybe there was a sense of blame he had. I mean, he was talking about the fact that his mother would put in like an envelope or something cocaine, and she would uh, bring that with her to the prison when she would visit Richie. And her intention was to keep him, she said, was to keep him, safe. Like if he has cocaine, I guess if he's able to go ahead and do, the deals he needs to do and sell that, then, they're not going to mess with him. Um, and so maybe he's like, you encouraged this lifestyle and, whether it was quote unquote fair or not, I wonder if there was a certain sense of you all are the reason that he's dead. But another thing came up while you all were talking, and I was wondering if this was kind of so later he has like a chosen family, right? And he does have a lot of deceased family members, so that may be a part of it. He also, you know, has some strain with his family, and so that all contributed to him having a chosen family. But I also wonder if this is kind of speaking to a certain sense of detachment that he has with his family, that in their time of mourning and their time of grief, he didn't want to stand by their side, like he didn't feel connected to them in that way. And I don't know how much of the story so far like indicates that, or how much of what we know about him would make that make sense. um but yeah, that's what came up in my mind.
For me, like I kind of made I understand this was a little bit further up in the passage, but I directly connected it with when he says that his mom, like her departing gift to Richie was a bag of drugs to be buried with him. Like for me, that kind of seemed like he was like angry. He had some anger towards them. Like that's where I kind of came to the conclusion, like, oh, he doesn't want to. He's upset that this is his family, this is his people, and he doesn't want to be a part of them in that sense, like in like a resentment kind of way. But you do bring up good points. Like I never even made that connection about maybe feeling like it was his fault in some way.
Hey Tribe, before you go, we wanted to chat with you about how you can help your fellow humans navigate collective grief and trauma. This season, each host has chosen a charity to share with you all. The charities we've selected have missions that address collective grief or trauma in some way. Our hope is that you'll find a charity whose mission aligns with your hopes for humanity.
You can check the description box for links to our fundraising pages. We encourage you all to explore the websites for information about each organization's impact and ensure you're making an informed decision when giving. InfoBlue Media has no affiliation with any of these charities or crowdfunding platforms. Thank you all for your consideration.
Journey well.